So a few days ago, I stumbled upon this blog, build a functional search bar in Nextjs. And the kind of nerd I am for Nextjs and other JavaScript frameworks, I was extremely excited to read this blog, and it was actually pretty insightful. And I wanted to see if they are using client-side rendering or server-side rendering to create a search bar. So what they're trying to do is essentially have similar kind of functionality. Like, let's say if you go to Amazon.com right now, and if you type something in the search bar, let's say I type clocks, and if I hit the search icon, the list here updates because the browser makes a request to the server and it returns a new list with clocks, and we have a website that works, and we have a functional search bar. How do you create something like this in Next.js? This is the topic for this blog. And the reason why I'm making a video on this is essentially because I wanted to see if they are using client-side components or server-side components to create a functional search bar. Now, if you don't know what a client-side component or a server-side component is, I'll try to explain it in the easiest way possible. So assume you have a static website for yourself. Let's say I make a portfolio for myself, and this is my About Me page. And in the About Me page, I have a bunch of paragraphs and an image, a header that says About Me. Now, if I just make this website in plain HTML, CSS and host it somewhere, and then I buy a domain, attach that domain to the server, and do all the crazy stuff that you need to do. And then if I do all of this and then go to my browser and search for the .dev, let's say this is the URL for my website. Now what happens is that my browser will make a request to that particular server, and the server will return me the HTML for the website, and my HTML would have a header, paragraph text, and an image as expected. In this particular case, my browser is getting all the rendered HTML from the server itself, and this is why it's called server-side rendering. So if you have a static web page, server-side rendering makes a lot of sense. However, we not necessarily always make websites that are static. We also have dynamic websites. Let's say in my previous website itself, I added a button, click me, and a count that increases when I click on this button. Now the website is no longer static. Now the website is dynamic because it needs to respond to user interactions on the web page. And when this happens, browser will have to take care of the interactions and fixing up the DOM according to those interactions. And these kind of things are managed by client-side components. So how does a client-side component work? Very simple. In this case, the browser doesn't get the rendered HTML like we get in the server-side rendering. Instead, in this particular case, we get something like this, which we want to turn into this. And to do that, client has to do some work. So let's say you're using React.js, which has client-side rendering by default. You might have seen something like this, right? And what happens is that on your browser itself, React will have to do all the overhead of figuring out where to place what particular node inside of the DOM. So where to place the header, the p tag, image, button, and everything else. So initially the browser will only get this and the JavaScript, and then that JavaScript will have to render the rest of the stuff in the browser. And this is why it's called client-side rendering. Pretty straightforward. You should probably also go to the documentation of Next.js, where you can go to the chapter 10, which talks about server and client components. And it actually explains everything in great details. So I would highly recommend you guys checking this out. Anyways, now let me ask you a question. Do you see a problem here? Initially, we had a static website like this, and in this case, we did server-side rendering and we got the entire HTML here in the browser directly from the request. And in the second case, we had a website that has an interactive element in it. And as soon as we had an interactive element, we shifted to client-side rendering because we want to make sure that users can interact with the element, and then the DOM structure and the values inside of the component might change according to the interactions. We needed client-sided rendering in the second case because JavaScript will have to listen to the events on the button, and then it would also have to find the particular count element inside of the DOM and then update it accordingly and do all the crazy stuff. In React.js, if you use React, what happens is that if you, let's say, have a button that on clicking updates the count here, then React will make sure that you don't actually go and update all the particular unnecessary nodes in the DOM. You only update the DOM that needs to be updated. So in that case, about me, paragraph, and image would not be updated in the DOM. Only the count will be updated, and this is to improve the performance of your web page. That's why React is super cool. However, the problem here is that since on the initial request you're getting something like this, which doesn't have any text or stuff like that, what happens is that this results in really bad SEO, first of all. So one thing that happens in client-side rendering is really bad SEO. That's a problem with client-side rendering. However, in case of server-side rendering, SEO is pretty good because you're essentially getting all the HTML on the first request itself. So that's a good thing because now Google crawlers can crawl your web page and they'll have a lot of content to go through, and then your site's SEO will improve. So in server-side rendering, of course, one thing that happens is that you get better SEO. But more importantly, there is another thing that happens in server-side rendering, which is that client doesn't have to run the JavaScript to figure out where to place the nodes in the DOM. And that saves a lot of overhead. That makes your website faster and perform better compared to the client-side rendering. Now, this is where I'll tell you why Next.js is one of my favorite frameworks and why it is one of the fastest growing JavaScript frameworks of all time. Because in Next.js, if you want to have some interactive component, you can make that a client-side component, and whatever static content you have, you can make that a server-side component. And if you do that, what happens is that this part of the website about me, I'm a paragraph and an image, will be rendered at the server itself, and the button and this particular paragraph will be rendered at the client. So what happens is, instead of rendering everything on the client, you're essentially rendering only the things that are interactive, and by doing so you're making the best use of both of the worlds of server side rendering and client side rendering. So now your website has better SEO, faster performance, and yes, everyone's winning. Next.js is the best framework. Yes, I'd suggest you to go through the Next.js documentation chapter 10, where they talk about server and client-side components. Once again, they have given a very nice example here. As you can see, footer is a static component, while a like button is a interactive component, because if you press the like button, you expect the number to go up, similar to a count, right? So you would make that a client side component and footer to a server side component, and when you do that, your website would be faster. Now in Next.js, if you make a component by default, it would be a server side component. Okay, and when you have a server side component, you cannot make it interactive. You cannot have stuff like use state, use effect that you have in React.js. So if you want to specifically make a component a client-based component, then what you have to do is you have to write use client on top of your file. And when you do that, now this component is a simple client-side component. So this will be rendered on the client itself, not on the server. And then you can use all the normal stuff that you do in React.js, stuff like use state or use effect or whatever you want to do. You can make it interactive. That's the whole point. So what Next.js allows us to do is you have server-side components and client-side components together in a web page and improve the overall performance of the web page. Now this is enough about Next.js. Let's go back to our blog. So in the blog, we want to make a functional search bar in Next.js. Now, since I've told you about client-side versus server-side rendering, you can now think of this UI, which is a search bar, a button, and items here. And you can immediately see that if you want to make something like this, the easiest way to do that would be to use a client-side component, because you would type something in the search bar, you will hit the submit button, and you would want the items to update accordingly, right? So you're expecting the UI to be interactive, and you're expecting the UI to change according to the user interaction. So you would think that this would be very easy to do with a client-side component. And I'd say, yes, you're right. That's exactly what we do in this blog. We create two client-side components. It's very simple. I'll go through the blog for you guys. So what they basically do is, I think they had a GitHub repo at the end. So it'll be easier for us if I go directly to the GitHub repo and show you guys the entire code. Right here, if I go through the code, and I'll show you guys how everything is working. They have two different components, a profile card, a search input. The search input is a client-side component. And notice how there is no use client on top of this. The reason why it is a client-side component is because on the parent of that particular component, we are using use client. So basically, this entire web page that they have created, this entire web page which has the search bar, submit button, and items, this entire web page is a client-side component. Now if I quickly go through their code, they have use effect, use state, and stuff like that, just like we do in React.js. And you can do that because you have defined use client on top of your file. So what happens is very simple. What they basically do is that we have input, right? And a list of all the items that you see here, and these items are filtered based on whatever the input is submitted by the user. And the way it works is very similar to how we do in websites like Amazon. So if I go to Amazon, notice how as soon as I've written clock and hit enter here, the URL has a query parameter which has the term clock here, and inside of their code they would be using this to filter out the list of items and show only the clocks. This is how a search bar actually works. And in this blog, they have replicated the same functionality. I'll link this blog in the description of this video, so go through it if you want to create that thing using client-side components. But that's the first half of this story. The second half of this story is this. So I also stumbled upon this video a couple of days ago. This video is by WebDev Cody. He's a really amazing human, amazing developer. I will definitely recommend you guys go and give him a follow and subscribe to his channel. Go follow him on Twitter or wherever you want to do that. I've only recently started following WebDev Cody, and he has a lot of interesting videos on web development. So if any of you guys are learning web development or are interested in stuff like that, you can subscribe to this channel and watch his videos. Anyways, so I was watching this video, why you will need client component in Next.js. This is a really amazing video. I will link this video in the description of my video, so go and watch this video also. TLDR of this video is Cody shows us how you can create a form on your website which would be rendered on the server itself. Now form is an interactive component. How is it an interactive component? Well, you type in some name, you type in some age, and you hit the submit. Then you expect the name and age would go away once the form is submitted. And when you are saying that you want the name and age input field to have nothing in themselves, when you submit it, that is interactivity, and you can only have it if you're running some JavaScript on your client side. But in this video, he shows us a trick how you can actually make all of this interactivity using server-side rendering. It's a pretty cool video. You should definitely go and watch the video. Anyways, the point is, after watching this video, I got curious and I wanted to see if I can create a functional search bar in Next.js as a server-side component totally. So I don't want to use client-side rendering at all. This is a small demo website that I've created. It just have a simple input and a button, and here I'm showing a list of a bunch of books, okay? And I'm fetching these books from an API. All of the components on this website are server-side rendered, which means I'm getting the entire HTML on the first load itself. So I have an input button. I also have list of books, and I have all the data filled in directly. Very good for the SEO and really fast because my browser doesn't have to do anything to make sure correct nodes are at their correct places in the DOM. Anyways, how this works right now is very simple. I type the name of the book. Let's say I type just, and then I hit search, and I get the correct response. The filtering happens, and all of this is happening on the server side. So if I go here, you'll see that I only have one element in the list. When I hit the search button, server has rendered this particular HTML that I'm seeing right here. My client side doesn't have to do anything at all. Browser doesn't need to do anything at all. All of this is server side rendered. Pretty cool, okay? So let's talk about the code for this particular demo. This is the code for the demo. The code is very simple. We just have a main page, a component, book list, and a API utility function. Alright, let's start with the main page itself. So as you can see, this is a server-side component. I'm using Nextjs, by the way. This is a server-side component because I haven't written use client on top. So this is rendered at the server side itself. In this page, I'm importing the component book list, which is also a server-side component. As you can see, I'm not using use client anywhere. Now in this book list component, I am passing a prop, which is the search term, and based on that search term, I'm filtering the books, and then only the books that have the title matching with the search term will be shown. This is pretty straightforward and easy to understand. So inside of my page, in the book list component, I'm passing this particular argument, search term, okay? But how did I get the search term? This is the interesting part, because how do I get the search term in the first place? Remember how it works in Amazon website? If you go to the Amazon website, once again, I show you, the URL has a query parameter. We can make use of this query parameter because this URL would be available at the server side also. So essentially the idea is, if you want to make UI changes based on some interaction in your website and you want the entire website to be server side rendered, then what you would need to do is you need to pass some flags through the URL, and based on those flags you have to send different HTML to the client, and that's exactly what I have done. So in this demo, if I type, let's say, the inside of the input box and I hit search, notice how the URL gets a query parameter as search term equals to the. And now what I do is, on the server side, I somehow extract this parameter from the URL and send it to the book list component. And then book list component filters out the list of the books and just returns the appropriate HTML to the browser. So the browser doesn't have to do anything. But how am I making sure it doesn't have to do anything? By doing everything on the server itself. And server can understand the URL, and server can make use of the stuff that we put inside of the URL. Is this the best way to do it? Probably not. But is it something that excited me and I wanted to do it? Yes. Now we still need to talk about one last thing, which is how am I able to submit a form without having some specific JavaScript for it on the client side? How am I submitting a form? This is where the video comes into play, because in this video he showed us how to submit a form using a server-side component, and there is a default way of doing that, of course. The way is by using a server action. So how do you do that is according to the docs. Again, Next.js has amazing docs. If you want to learn Next.js, go through the entire documentation. That's what I have done, and that's what you should be do. I'd suggest that. Anyways, if you want to submit a form, what you can do is you can make use of something called as server action. What that basically is, let's say you have a form. This is the form, and you can define an action, and the action would run on the server itself. So what happens in my code is, this is the form which has, this is a simple form which has an input and a button. Notice how I don't have any event listeners on the button. I'm not listening to any changes in the input at all, because I cannot. To do that, I would have to use a client-side component. Anyways, what I have done instead is I have written a server action. So when the form is submitted, this handle submit action would run on the server. And how does my browser know that this is supposed to run on the server? Well, because I have written use server in the function itself. So this is the server action. This action runs on the server. Notice how none of these things are happening on client. Everything is happening on the server. This is like the coolest shit ever, and it just excites me a lot when I write this code, when I read this code. So yeah, this is a server action, and this server action is very simple. All it does is that it redirects us to the same URL but with a query parameter, and the query parameter has the search term, and we can get the search term from the form data. So when the form is submitted, we run a server action that receives the form data, and from the form data we get the search term, because search term was written inside of the input. So we get the search term, we append it to the URL using a query parameter notation. And when we do that and when we redirect, what happens is the browser makes another request to the server, and this time the server will have a different URL. The URL would be this time the URL would be localhost 3001 slash a query parameter search term equals to the, right? And when I have a query parameter inside of my URL, I can get that on the server itself, because the server can access the URL. So what you can do is you can write something like this in your server component, and you can get the search parameters from the URL itself. And here I'm getting the search parameter, which is named as search term. So notice how this is search term here, and this is search term here. I'm getting this in my server component. And then what I do is I send this search term. Remember the book list component? I send this search term to the book list component, which filters out the book for me. And that's how I am able to have a functionality that looks like it's not possible to achieve without using a client-side component. I'm able to do all of that stuff using a server-side component. Pretty cool stuff. I don't know if you're equally interested in Nextjs or not, but this was very exciting for me. This video was very exciting for me to make. I will drop the link of all of these things, the blog, the video, Nextjs documentation, even though you can find it online very easily. And I will even push this code, this demo on my GitHub, and I'll link that also in the description of this video. Plus in the description you will find a link of my Discord server, which you can join in case you wanna join a community of programmers, or you just want to talk to me, ask me something. If you have doubts, I can give you guidance and stuff like that, and a bunch of other cool links where you can follow me if you want to. Either way, I hope you had fun, and I hope you got to learn something, and I'll see you in the next video now. Thank you so much for watching.